Hey everybody, thank you so much for being on the second ever episode of I Am Gaming Podcast, a podcast that talks about the video game industry, entrepreneurship, and gaming nostalgia. My name is Ivica, and in this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about the whole retro approach many people are using, especially when it comes to indie and small games. Small teams and individual developers decide to make. Apart from that, I'm also going to talk about a single clothing or streetwear brand called Death Saves, and it's a good example, at least in my case, in my view, of a successful retro play, let's call it that utilizes the retro approach but doesn't skew it in a way that's actually bad for your end product. At least that's how I feel about it. Before we get into all of that, I'm just going to have to do a little bit of a shout out for a really cool indie game you should check out right now. The game is called Fate Game, and you can find it on itch.io. It's made by a really cool indie designer. I got to know him and talk to him a lot through Twitter. You can also find him at Fate Apps, and he's a cool guy. He created a great couch multiplayer 2-stick game. I'm reading this from the description. I haven't tried it, but it's a really cool title. It looks really cool, and it got some nice industry eyeballs, so please check it out. I'm giving this shout out because he recommended my podcast to some indie buddies who started following me. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope I don't disappoint. Lastly, before we get into the actual main topic, I have a Patreon page. That's probably no surprise. Everybody has a podcast these days, and everyone else has a Patreon page. So if you enjoy this in any shape or form, if you find it promising, I would really appreciate if you could pitch in anything. So I'm not looking for any particular sum. Patreon is actually a great promotional tool. I'm going to talk about it probably later on in some episode. Not exactly as a tool that brings you a whole lot of cash, but as a tool that helps you build a community and connect with people who actually really enjoy your output. And for creators, I'm also working on a small podcast, sci-fi and technology, that's called Photon Tide. It's in Serbian with a few of my friends. We really appreciate any money, any support we get. So I decided to make a page for my gaming podcast as well. So if you have some spare change, literally anything, I would really appreciate any kind of support. Right now I don't have any tiers or anything like that. It just boils down to basically, hey, Ivice, we like the thing you're doing, here's $1. Now, with all of that, that was a long intro. Let's get into the whole retro deal. So retro and retro gaming isn't anything new. It's basically a movement that's been around for more than a decade now. It's interesting for me because as an old gamer, I started gaming in 1990. At the first moment it was kind of a weird throwback to a period that was important but not that crucial. It was pixel art. When I was a kid, I never particularly enjoyed pixel art as pixel art. It was just art back then. And now, after like 15 years later, it came back. And it came back big time. So today, retro basically means for a lot of people pixel art in the game dev industry. You can check out on Twitter like hashtags like Screenshot Saturday, and you'll see that a lot of games are taking the pixel art approach. Now, pixel art is cool because it's basically a way to create graphics without having dedicated artists or having literally like a system where you can churn out graphics quickly and easily. Now, that's cool, but a lot of people are not doing it because of that. They're doing it because they think it's cool. And there's another kind of a mentality going on there, which states basically, as I see it, retro is catchy, retro is cool, and retro is profitable. Now, retro might be cool, I'm not denying that, a lot of people love it, but is it profitable? Not that sure. Is it catchy? It's not. Now, this is the main thing here. Doing too much retro is good in theory if you know what you're doing and what you're aiming for. Doing too little retro is also good in theory, again, if you know what you're aiming for. A lot of developers, sadly, as I see it, don't have an actual clear mission statement when it comes to art, or even the whole retro approach, that it doesn't have to be art, only art. It can be also gaming mechanics, simplified genres like in platformers and stuff like that. All of that is cool as long as you have an end goal with all of that. So having an end goal, having a clear vision of a game you want to make is crucial, because all of these things are actually perks that you can put in the forefront, or that can be not that clear to the potential player. But in any case, it's a perk. It's not the thing that actually buys people to get into your game, even in development or later on as an end product. If you're saturating the market with retro look and feel, you won't stick out if you do the same retro look and feel. The point here is that simply saying we're going to do beautiful pixel art, like for example in Hyper Light Drifter, is great if you can make a Hyper Light Drifter. But even outside the pixel art graphics, Hyper Light Drifter is much more than a retro game. It's a brilliant sci-fi story with an excellent atmosphere that's really minimalistic and at the same time deep impacting, and it has a lot of things going for it. Retro art and retro feel is only the topmost layer. In any of these cases, it's actually the simplicity that carries the day. You have to have a clear idea what you're making. The best way to do that is to have something you're emulating, not in the terms of graphics or only mechanics, but in the terms of actual game feel and the whole gaming experience. So just saying we're going to take pixel art, make a game look great, and then we'll figure out what the game is all about is cool if you're a pixel art artist. But if you're a game developer, you have to have a clear idea before you decide to go for perks, or before you decide to go for these kinds of, let's say it, skinning, like when you're buying a skin and you're adding that skin to an already defined thing. If you don't have that defined thing, the skin won't matter. So retro is cool, pixel art is cool, all of that is cool. It becomes catchy and becomes profitable in the end if you have a solid foundation on which you place that retro and pixel art and everything else. So focus more on the precise and clear idea of your game than you focus on the skinning of the same idea. Especially if you don't have an idea, it's pointless to skin it in anything. So this might sound like Captain Obvious giving advices, but I'm going to show you why I think this really applies to a brand called That Saves. So it's a streetwear brand that was designed, created, or started or partnered with an actor called Joe Manganiello. You probably know him from US TV shows and movies, and he began a brand that's essentially a huge homage to D&D and 1980s, early 1990s metal music. And that's the whole idea. The idea was, I'm betting, a lot older than going for images of dragons, taking the D&D dices and rehashing them into a million different forms, anything of that. So the idea was to catch and focus on that feel of D&D, playing D&D in your basement. I mean, this is for US listeners. The rest of the world isn't that big on basements. Just, I have to tell you, we did play D&D, but not in basements or in like those Stranger Things kind of environment. I grew up in 80s. We didn't have any of that in Yugoslavia. So yeah, a lot of other places didn't have it either. But in his case, or the That Saves brand, they went for that, exactly that feel. So all of those things that you kind of remember when you were a kid, of those like older guys and girls who were into metal, who had those awful stickers, jackets, jewelry, and everything that was basically tacky. They took it and they created a brand out of it. So they had, in my view, a really clear idea of what they're aiming for. They then took those additional skin elements and created t-shirts, visual identity, played around of all of those like VHS effects, crappy movies from the 1980s of horror movies and everything else. They took it and added it upon the basic idea. But the idea is rock solid, and the whole brand for me is super well defined. I think that's a great thing to have for any kind of a product that aims to communicate with the audience. The same goes for games, because if you have that essence that is clearly visible to your potential customers, buyers, community members, whatever, you can connect with them and you can add additional value upon that basic idea and make it even more interesting, more catchy, more profitable. But if the basic idea is not there, adding anything, it is like basically throwing rocks into a ravine, hoping they pile up eventually. They probably won't. And in this case, the same applies. So I think you should definitely just check out Death Saves and see a brand identity, which is only an intellectual thing. It's like D&D meets old school metal music, but not in terms of music, but in terms of visual identity. And everything else stems from that basic connection. For retro games, I believe it's a big potential lesson that can be learned from Death Saves. Now, as well as I'm talking about brands here, I just want to, I can't talk about brands without doing again a small shout out to great friends of mine, Sonia and Marco. Marco is actually my best man. He was my best man on my wedding. And they have a really cool women wear called cozy2wear.com. You can find it online. Links are in the description below, like all the links I mentioned or I'm going to mention in this podcast. So check them out. They're really cool. They provide and make great clothing for women, for girls. I think you're gonna love it. And I can't talk about brands without fashion brands without mentioning that one, right? It would be like a heresy. That's what we do. We plug each other. And with that small kind of a plug, I'm going to end this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear your takes on the idea of going retro, and especially on Death Saves, what you think about the brand and everything else. Please leave a comment below, and don't forget to check out my Patreon page. If you like what you hear here, please subscribe to my channel and consider leaving something as a donation on my Patreon. That was all for me. Thank you so much for being on my second episode, especially if you're a first-time listener, viewer. You don't have that much to view, but a first-time listener, I would really appreciate a subscribe and everything else I talked about earlier. Again, my name is Ivica. This was the second episode of I'm Gaming Podcast. Hopefully, I'm going to see all of you on the third episode as well. Until then, bye-bye.